For 1,000 years, the city stood untouched, its colossal walls unbroken, its towers defiant against time itself. Constantinople, the queen of cities, had faced the storms of empires and never fallen. Yet one morning in the spring of 1453, the world would change forever. The sky trembled with thunder, not of storms, but of cannon fire. Across the plains outside its mighty walls, the earth shook as bronze monsters roared. And from the sea, something no one had ever imagined was unfolding: ships, warships, rolling across the land itself. The air was thick with smoke, faith, and fear. Outnumbered 10-1, the defenders of this ancient capital braced themselves for the final reckoning. Would courage and faith be enough to preserve a civilization built over a millennium? Or would the dreams of a young conqueror crush it beneath the weight of a new age, an age of gunpowder and iron? Constantinople was no ordinary city. It was the heart of the Byzantine Empire, once the beating center of a world that stretched from Egypt to Italy. Founded in 330 AD by Constantine the Great, it was meant to be the new Rome, a city blessed by God and guarded by 3 impenetrable walls. Its great dome, the Hagia Sophia, glittered with gold mosaics that caught the morning light like fire from heaven. For over 1,000 years, it had stood as the bridge between 2 worlds, Europe and Asia, Christianity and Islam, the past and the future. But by the middle of the 15th century, the Byzantine Empire was a ghost of its former glory. What had once been an empire was now a single city surrounded by enemies. Inside its walls, barely 50,000 souls remained: priests, merchants, and soldiers who clung to their faith as much as to their fading power. Still, Constantinople remained a symbol, the last bastion of Christian Rome, the final remnant of an empire that refused to die. To the rising Ottoman Empire, however, that symbol was an insult. The great empire of Islam had surrounded Constantinople on all sides, and only the walls stood between the young Sultan Mehmed II and the fulfillment of destiny. At just 21 years old, Mehmed was brilliant, ambitious, and utterly relentless. His eyes were fixed on one goal: to conquer the unconquerable city and etch his name into eternity. For Mehmed, Constantinople was not just a prize. It was prophecy. For centuries, Muslim scholars had spoken of a great ruler who would one day claim the city of Constantine. Mehmed believed that ruler was him. But prophecy alone would not bring down walls that had repelled armies of Persians, Arabs, and Crusaders. To win, he needed something new, something the world had never seen. He found it in a Hungarian engineer named Orban, a master of early artillery. Orban had built cannons before, but none like the one he forged for Mehmed, the Great Bombard. Over 8 meters long and cast entirely of bronze, it could hurl stone balls weighing nearly half a ton. Each shot was so powerful it shook the ground like an earthquake. The age of the sword was ending. The age of gunpowder had begun. As spring approached, Mehmed gathered his vast army, nearly 100,000 men from every corner of his empire: Turkish cavalry, Balkan infantry, archers, and his most feared warriors of all, the Janissaries. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were taken from Christian families as children, trained for years, and molded into elite troops loyal only to the Sultan. Their discipline was unmatched. Their faith in victory, absolute. Facing them were only 7,000 to 8,000 defenders, Byzantine soldiers, a handful of volunteers, and 2,000 Genoese mercenaries under the command of Giovanni Giustiniani, a seasoned Italian warrior whose courage and skill in siege warfare made him invaluable. The city's strength lay not in numbers, but in its walls, the legendary Theodosian walls. For more than 1,000 years, these walls had been the most formidable fortifications in the world, 3 layers of defenses stretching 6 kilometers, with moats, towers, and battlements that had turned back every enemy. The Huns had failed. The Persians had failed. The Arabs, even the Crusaders, had failed. No one had ever breached them. But no one had ever faced Mehmed's cannons either. On the morning of April 6, 1453, the Ottoman army appeared on the horizon like a dark tide. Their tents spread across the plains, banners fluttering beneath the crescent moon. The air pulsed with the beat of war drums and the sound of thousands of voices chanting prayers to God. Then came the silence, brief, heavy, waiting. When the first cannon fired, it was as if the earth itself cried out. The Great Bombard roared, and a half-ton stone ball soared through the air, smashing against the Theodosian walls with a thunderous crack. Dust and fragments filled the sky. For the first time in a millennium, the walls of Constantinople shook under a weapon made of fire. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last emperor of Byzantium, stood upon the ramparts, watching the smoke rise. He knew the truth. The city was alone. No great army from Europe would come. The once mighty empire had been reduced to faith, stone, and courage. And as he looked upon his weary soldiers and the terrified faces of his people, he swore they would fight to the very end. The siege of Constantinople had begun. The dawn of April 6, 1453, marked the beginning of the end. Outside the ancient walls of Constantinople, the plains had become a living sea of men and steel. Tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers stood ready. Cavalry horses snorted in the cold morning air, banners rippled beneath the rising sun, and from the heart of the encampment came the low, rhythmic pounding of war drums that echoed across the Golden Horn. The defenders, huddled atop the weathered stone battlements, could only watch as the ground trembled. From their vantage point, they saw the massive bronze barrels of Mehmed's cannons being dragged into position by teams of oxen. Each one was a monstrosity. The largest required 60 beasts to move. Behind them, sappers and engineers worked feverishly, loading the great bombards with powder and shot. Then, in a single shattering moment, silence fell. The first cannon fired. The roar was like thunder cracking open the sky. The earth shook. A stone ball, so large it could crush a man flat, hurtled through the air and slammed into the Theodosian walls. Dust exploded upward, and a sound like the groaning of a wounded giant rolled through the city. For the defenders, that sound was a nightmare given form. For the Ottomans, it was the herald of victory. Day after day, the cannon fire continued. The great bronze monsters belched flame and smoke, pounding the walls relentlessly. By night, the Byzantines scrambled to fill the breaches with rubble, wood, and earth. Their hands bled from the labor, their eyes burned from the smoke. But still they worked, because to stop was to die. Emperor Constantine XI moved constantly along the walls, his cloak stained with dust, his armor dulled by the grime of battle. He spoke to his soldiers by name, clasping their shoulders, reminding them that they were not merely defending a city, they were defending the last fragment of the Roman Empire, the last light of a dying world. His presence gave the defenders strength. But he knew it was only a matter of time before strength alone would not be enough. Mehmed II, meanwhile, was calm and calculating. From his tent, he surveyed the siege lines through a brass telescope, directing his officers with quiet authority. He divided his forces into 3 grand divisions. On his right, soldiers from Anatolia, hardened men from the Turkish heartlands. On his left, troops from the Balkans, veterans of dozens of campaigns. And at the center, the pride of his army, the Janissaries, his elite corps of fanatical warriors. Each day, the Ottomans rotated their units to keep them fresh, while the defenders, outnumbered 10 to 1, grew more weary with every sunrise. Still, the walls held. The sea, however, was another matter. Mehmed's fleet of over 100 warships prowled the waters outside the Golden Horn. But there, the Byzantines had a surprise, the Great Iron Chain. It stretched across the mouth of the harbor, linking towers on both sides and blocking entry to any enemy vessel. As long as that chain held, the sea was theirs. Inside the city, life carried on in the shadow of death. The Hagia Sophia was filled day and night with prayers, the scent of burning incense mingling with the acrid smoke from the bombardments. Mothers brought their children to be blessed, soldiers confessed their sins, and priests spoke of miracles that might yet come. The people's faith was all that kept despair at bay. Then, on April 20th, hope seemed to arrive from the horizon. 3 small Christian ships appeared, sailing under the flags of Genoa and Byzantium, laden with grain and supplies. Behind them came an Ottoman fleet, dozens of galleys racing to intercept. What followed was a fierce and desperate naval clash beneath the city walls. The defenders watched from the ramparts as the Christian ships, smaller and outnumbered, fought like lions. They rammed Ottoman vessels, poured boiling pitch upon their decks, and fired flaming arrows into their sails. Against all odds, the three ships broke through. As they entered the Golden Horn, the bells of Constantinople rang out in triumph. Cheers echoed through the streets. For the first time in weeks, joy filled the air. But it was short-lived. The supplies were limited, and the reinforcements, few. The West had not come to save them. They would have to stand alone. By late April, the siege had become a brutal rhythm. Cannon fire by day, rebuilding by night, and endless watchfulness in between. Mehmed's engineers continued to push their batteries closer, shortening the range, increasing the devastation. Massive chunks of the wall fell away under the ceaseless pounding. Yet the defenders refused to yield. For every breach opened by the cannons, men like Giustiniani and his Genoese mercenaries rushed forward to fill it. Their armor gleamed red with dust and blood, their faces lined with exhaustion but unbroken resolve. Wherever the fighting was fiercest, Giustiniani was there, shouting commands in Italian and Greek, holding the line with stubborn ferocity. Still, Mehmed knew he had to break the stalemate. He was not a man who tolerated defiance for long. And so, in the final days of April, the young Sultan devised a plan that would defy reason itself. A plan so audacious that even his own commanders doubted it could be done. If he could not sail his ships into the Golden Horn, he would carry them there. By the final days of April 1453, the siege had ground into a deadly stalemate. The Ottoman cannons thundered endlessly, but the walls of Constantinople, though cracked and battered, still stood. The great iron chain across the Golden Horn held firm, guarding the harbor from Mehmed's fleet. The city, though starving and exhausted, refused to bow. And that is when Sultan Mehmed II conceived one of the boldest military maneuvers in history. If his ships could not pass the chain that barred the harbor, he would take them overland. Even his closest generals hesitated at the idea. The terrain north of the Golden Horn was steep, rough, and forested. To drag entire ships, some weighing several tons, over the hills of Galata seemed madness. But Mehmed was not a man to be confined by what others thought possible. He ordered his engineers to begin preparations immediately. Within days, a long wooden pathway was laid across the hills, stretching from the Ottoman docks on the Bosphorus to the inner side of the Golden Horn. The planks were greased with animal fat to make them slick. At dawn, teams of oxen and hundreds of soldiers began the impossible. One by one, galleys and warships were hauled out of the water, mounted on wheeled platforms, and dragged up the slopes. The operation was as spectacular as it was terrifying. Drums boomed in rhythm with the chanting of soldiers. The ground shook with the creak of ropes and the rumble of wooden rollers. By torchlight, the people of Constantinople watched from their walls in utter disbelief as the impossible unfolded before their eyes. Then, on the morning of April 22nd, the unthinkable happened. Dozens of Ottoman warships slid down the far slope and splashed into the waters of the Golden Horn, behind the Byzantine chain, inside the very harbor that had been considered impenetrable. The defenders stood frozen. The unbreakable barrier of the Golden Horn had been outflanked, not by force, but by ingenuity. Panic swept through the city. The harbor walls had always been Constantinople's weakest point, lower, thinner, and less fortified than the massive land walls. Now, with enemy ships inside the Golden Horn, the defenders had to split their forces. Emperor Constantine and Giustiniani rushed men and artillery to the waterfront, desperately repositioning what few cannons and catapults they had. From that moment, the siege became a nightmare. The Ottoman fleet inside the harbor joined the cannons on land, pounding the city from two sides. Arrows rained down from ships anchored within sight of the walls. The defenders fought back with whatever they could muster, firing from towers, launching Greek fire, and even hurling stones by hand. Venetian and Genoese sailors led skirmishes on the water, clashing with Ottoman crews in small, vicious naval duels. But the psychological blow had already been struck. For the first time in its thousand-year history, Constantinople was completely surrounded. No side was safe. No wall could be trusted. The people knew it, and even the emperor could see fear creeping into the hearts of his soldiers. Still, the Byzantines fought on. By day, they manned the walls. By night, they prayed in the Hagia Sophia, their chants echoing beneath the vast golden dome. Candles flickered across the marble floor as priests urged their flock to remain steadfast. Many believed a miracle would come, that God would not abandon his city. But outside, Mehmed's cannons continued to roar, drowning out even the sound of prayer. Day after day, the bombardment grew more savage. The Great Bombard and its smaller companions tore at the walls without mercy. Every shot loosened more stones, widened more cracks, and weakened the foundation of hope itself. The defenders patched what they could, but exhaustion was taking its toll. Food was running low. Men slept standing up, leaning on their spears. Then came May. With the arrival of the new month, the siege turned from grim to hellish. The nights were lit by fire and screams. Mehmed ordered fresh assaults to test the defenders' endurance. On May 7th and again on May 12th, waves of Ottoman soldiers hurled themselves at the walls. Ladders slammed against stone. Arrows darkened the sky. From above, the Byzantines poured boiling oil and rocks on the attackers, driving them back each time. The ground outside the city became a graveyard of shattered ladders and broken men. Yet Mehmed pressed on. Every failed assault taught him something, where the walls were weakest, where the defenders were thinnest, and how close his cannons were to breaking the ancient defenses once and for all. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine refused to yield. He walked the ramparts each day, speaking softly to his men, thanking them for their courage. He reminded them that they were fighting not just for their city, but for the memory of 1,000 years of Roman glory. To many, his calm presence was the last beacon of hope left in a collapsing world. And still, the cannons thundered. By mid-May, the Theodosian walls were little more than mangled stone and crumbling earth. Mehmed knew the time was drawing near. One more massive push, and the city would break. He ordered his engineers to bring the bombards even closer, so close that the next volley would tear open a breach wide enough for entire regiments to march through. Inside Constantinople, the defenders could feel it. The storm was gathering. Every sound from beyond the walls carried the rhythm of something final, something irreversible. The night before the end was eerily still. After weeks of thunder and fire, silence hung over Constantinople like a shroud. The air smelled of smoke and dust, mingled with the faint scent of burning oil. The walls that had once seemed eternal were scarred and crumbling, their towers cracked, their stones blackened by endless cannon fire. Everyone in the city, soldier, priest, and child alike, knew what that silence meant. The storm was coming. On May 28, 1453, the weary citizens of Constantinople gathered for what they knew would be their final night. In the great Hagia Sophia, the golden dome glowed dimly in the candlelight. Thousands crowded inside, Greeks, Latins, soldiers, and commoners alike, kneeling together in prayer. For one night, centuries of division vanished. Old enemies embraced, tears streaked with dust and soot. The emperor himself entered the church, laying down his sword before the altar. He prayed not for victory, he knew that was beyond hope, but for courage, for dignity, for the strength to meet the dawn. As night deepened, Emperor Constantine XI walked the ramparts one last time. He looked out upon the plain where the Ottoman campfires burned like a field of stars. Beyond them, he could see the silhouettes of cannons, siege towers, and tents stretching to the horizon. The sound of distant drums pulsed through the darkness, slow, measured, relentless. He knew that when those drums quickened, the end would begin. At the same hour, in the Ottoman camp, Sultan Mehmed II prepared his final assault. He had waited for this moment his entire life. Clad in armor of blackened steel, he rode between the lines of his soldiers, speaking words of faith and fire. "The city of Constantine will be ours," he told them. "Tonight, we write the next chapter of history." Shortly before dawn on May 29th, the drums began to thunder. Horns blared across the plains. And with that, the last siege of Constantinople reached its climax. The first wave of attackers surged forward, irregular troops, volunteers, and zealots eager for glory and plunder. They came screaming out of the darkness, ladders in hand, arrows flying. The defenders met them with a storm of death. Arrows rained down from the walls, stones crashed onto helmets, and boiling oil poured from the battlements. The moat filled with bodies. Yet, as dawn's light broke, the waves kept coming. When the first assault faltered, Mehmed sent in the second wave, his regular troops from Anatolia and the Balkans. Better trained, better armed, and far more disciplined, they advanced in grim silence, step by step, over the corpses of the first. Arrows blackened the sky, drums beat faster, and the roar of battle became deafening. Still, the defenders held. The ancient walls, though broken and cracked, refused to yield. But the Ottomans were wearing them down. Every hour of combat drained the defenders' strength. Their arrows ran low, their spears splintered, their hands trembled from exhaustion. Then came the third wave, the Janissaries. They marched forward like an iron tide, shields locked, faces grim beneath their helms. They did not shout, they chanted. Their voices rose as one, echoing over the battlefield, a terrifying sound that cut through the clash of steel. Behind them, the Great Bombard fired one last time. The ground shook. A section of the wall collapsed. The Janissaries charged. The battle became a chaos of smoke and blood. Giustiniani, the Genoese commander, was struck by a cannon fragment and carried from the wall, bleeding. His departure broke the defenders' morale. Without their leader, the line wavered. At a small postern gate known as the Kirkaporta, a handful of Ottoman soldiers discovered an entrance left unsecured. They forced it open. It was the beginning of the end. Ottoman soldiers poured through the breach. Trumpets blared from the towers. Panic spread along the walls. Constantine tried to rally his men, crying out above the noise, "The city is lost, but I live no longer as emperor." Throwing aside his imperial regalia, he drew his sword and plunged into the melee. He fought as a common soldier among his people, his armor gleaming in the dawn light. Witnesses later said he vanished beneath the press of battle, his body never found. With him died the thousand-year-old dream of the Roman Empire. By mid-morning, the banner of the crescent moon rose over the towers of Constantinople. The gates were thrown open. The city that had withstood a millennium of sieges was finally broken. Ottoman soldiers flooded through the streets, their cries of victory echoing through the marble halls and narrow alleys. For 3 days, chaos reigned. The city that had once been the jewel of Christendom burned. The great palaces were looted, churches stripped bare. The Hagia Sophia, that magnificent symbol of faith, was entered by the conquerors. Beneath its golden dome, Sultan Mehmed II dismounted his horse and knelt upon the marble floor. He ordered the great church to be converted into a mosque. And in that single act, the world changed. Mehmed was no longer merely a conqueror. He was now Mehmed the Conqueror, ruler of the new Ottoman world. For the people of Constantinople, the fall was an ending. For Mehmed, it was a beginning. But history would soon reveal that this was not just the fall of a city, it was the end of an era. The Middle Ages had died on the walls of Constantinople, giving birth to something new. As the sun rose higher on May 29, 1453, the light of a new world spilled across the broken stones of Constantinople. The banners of the crescent moon fluttered above the city's towers, where for 1,000 years the double-headed eagle of Byzantium had flown. Smoke curled from the ruins. The thunder of cannons had faded, replaced by the distant cries of victory and mourning. The queen of cities had fallen. For more than a millennium, Constantinople had been the living symbol of the Christian East, the fortress of Rome's legacy, the city of emperors and saints. Now it was silent. Its walls lay shattered, its streets filled with the echoes of battle. The last great empire of the ancient world was gone. But from its ashes, something vast and new was being born. When Sultan Mehmed II entered the city, he did so not as a destroyer, but as a ruler claiming his throne. He rode slowly through the gate of St. Romanus, the same gate his cannons had torn open only hours before. His armor glinted in the sunlight, and behind him marched his Janissaries, silent, disciplined, and victorious. The Sultan looked upon the devastation, and for a moment, even he seemed struck by its solemnity. The great city, long desired by emperors and caliphs alike, now lay at his feet. He dismounted at the steps of the Hagia Sophia, the heart of Byzantine faith. Inside, candles still burned where desperate prayers had been whispered only the night before. The golden mosaics glimmered in the filtered light, depicting Christ, the Virgin, and the saints of old. Mehmed gazed upon them, then gave a single command. The Hagia Sophia would stand, but it would be reborn as a mosque. In that moment, Constantinople ceased to be Byzantine and became Ottoman. The transformation was more than political, it was civilizational. The city that had once been Rome's last fortress was now the shining capital of a new empire, one that would dominate 3 continents for the next 5 centuries. To the Islamic world, it was a triumph beyond measure. To Europe, it was a catastrophe that shook the very foundation of Christendom. Across the continent, church bells tolled in mourning. In Rome, Pope Nicholas V wept. If the greatest Christian city could fall, what was safe? The cry for a new crusade spread through Europe, but the world had already changed too much for crusades. The Middle Ages had died that day, crushed beneath the cannons of Mehmed the Conqueror. Yet history has a strange way of balancing destruction with rebirth. From the fall of Constantinople came the sparks of transformation that would reshape the world. The ancient trade routes to Asia were now under Ottoman control. Spices, silk, and gold, all once flowing through Constantinople, became more expensive, more dangerous to obtain. Europe, desperate for new paths to the east, turned to the sea. Within a generation, explorers like Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama would sail into the unknown, discovering new lands and opening the age of exploration. At the same time, the fall of the city scattered its scholars, artists, and philosophers across Italy. They carried with them forgotten Greek manuscripts, texts of science, philosophy, and art that had been preserved in Byzantine libraries while the rest of Europe languished in darkness. These texts ignited a revolution of the mind, the Renaissance. Thus, the fall of Constantinople did not merely end an empire, it shifted the course of human history. It marked the death of the medieval world and the birth of the modern age. For the Ottomans, the city became Istanbul, the heart of an empire that stretched from Hungary to Arabia, from Egypt to Persia. Mehmed II transformed it into a jewel of Islamic architecture and learning, a place where cultures intertwined, where East met West not in battle, but in exchange. Centuries later, historians would look back on that May morning and see more than tragedy. They would see a turning point, the moment when the age of castles and knights gave way to the age of empires and discovery, when faith met fire and the world forever changed. Constantinople's walls had finally fallen, but its legacy endured. It lived on in every new empire that rose, every voyage that set sail, and every artist who dreamed of rebirth from ruin. On May 29, 1453, the medieval world died, but from its ashes rose the world we know today.